It began with a quiet stretch of land on the outskirts of town, 100 acres of rolling hills and a wide reservoir tucked neatly into the valley. For decades it had belonged to Richard Hale, a man in his late 50s who had inherited the property from his grandfather. Richard wasn't a flashy man. He worked as an engineer in the city for most of his life, and had always treated the land as a kind of sanctuary, a place where he could fish at dawn, walk the ridges at dusk, and remind himself that while money came and went, the land never lied. It was steady, dependable, and for him, sacred. But things changed when the suburbs began to expand. New developers eyed the valley with hungry interest. The town had grown, and so had the demand for neatly boxed houses, the kind that came with vinyl siding, identical mailboxes, and mandatory homeowners associations. At first, Richard didn't pay much attention to it. The land had been his family's for nearly a century. No one had ever questioned that. But when he started noticing surveyor trucks parked near his fence line and strangers walking the edges of his property with clipboards, his chest grew tight. Something was happening, and no one had told him. Then came the first letter. It arrived in a crisp white envelope bearing the logo of a local HOA board. The wording was vague but threatening. They claimed his property was in dispute, and that a section of it had already been designated for planned community development. Richard thought it had to be some kind of mistake. He took the letter to a lawyer friend in town who frowned at the language. "This isn't a mistake," the lawyer said, tapping the page. "This is a land grab, and they're using bureaucracy to make it look legitimate." Richard fought back the only way he knew how, through paperwork, court filings, and meetings. But every step seemed to tighten the net around him. The HOA wasn't just one neighbor with a clipboard. It was a machine, tied to developers, investors, and even members of the county zoning board. Within months, Richard watched in disbelief as construction crews broke ground on his lower acres. Bulldozers churned the soil where his grandfather had once planted corn. Cement trucks rumbled in convoys, and before long, wooden frames rose up like skeletal fingers, 30 identical homes taking shape on the very land that had been in his family for generations. The shock turned to anger, and the anger turned to something deeper. He went to the site one morning, walking the edges where his fence line used to be. A construction foreman told him to leave, or the HOA would have him arrested for trespassing on his own land. Richard clenched his fists, feeling the humiliation burn. It wasn't just theft. It was erasure. They were acting as if he had never existed, as if the deeds, the history, the blood and sweat of his family meant nothing. And then came the fines. Yes, fines. Letters arrived in his mailbox claiming he owed the HOA money for neglected landscaping, improper drainage, and failure to comply with community guidelines. It was absurd, laughable even, except that every letter came with escalating dollar amounts and warnings of liens. When he ignored them, lawyers for the HOA filed motions in court. Suddenly, Richard found himself not just losing land, but being told he owed tens of thousands of dollars for homes he never approved, for a neighborhood that didn't exist on paper until a few months ago. The absurdity would have been funny if it weren't devastating. His lawyer warned him that if he didn't fight strategically, they could push him toward foreclosure. His reservoir, his pride and joy, was also at risk, since it sat just above the new development and was being treated as a shared water resource in some of their filings. Richard sat at his kitchen table one night, surrounded by paperwork, the reservoir glimmering through his window in the moonlight. That was when he made a quiet promise to himself. They might steal his land. They might bury him in debt. But they had forgotten one crucial thing: the water. The reservoir wasn't just a pond. It was a fully engineered system, something Richard's grandfather had designed decades ago with help from local farmers. A series of gates and channels allowed him to control the flow. It had been used for irrigation once, but Richard had kept it in good repair out of pride and practicality. And now, as he stared at the papers threatening his livelihood, he realized it might be his final weapon. Still, Richard wasn't reckless. He didn't rush into anything. He documented everything: the illegal construction, the letters, the way HOA board members dismissed him in public meetings. He tried again and again to push back through legal means. But every path was blocked. Judges delayed hearings. County clerks misplaced filings. His calls to state regulators went unanswered. It was as though the HOA had woven itself into every layer of power, every desk that could have offered him justice. And so the homes continued to rise. Within a year, the development looked complete. 30 neat, beige-colored houses standing in rows like clone soldiers. A sign went up at the entrance, "Welcome to Willow Creek Estates, a premier HOA community." Richard drove past it one morning and felt his stomach twist. Willow Creek. That was the name his grandfather had given to the reservoir. They had stolen even that. Neighbors began moving in, families with children, retirees looking for quiet living, young couples stretching their first mortgages. Many of them had no idea their dream home stood on stolen land. They were polite enough when Richard passed by, but some had already been told that he was the problem. The bitter old man who refused to let progress happen. One man even told him at a grocery store, "You should be grateful. They raised your property values." Richard had laughed bitterly. "Property value means nothing when you don't even own the property anymore," he replied. But behind his simmering anger, Richard kept his focus. He still had the reservoir. He still had the gate. And while he wasn't planning on recklessness, the idea of balance, of nature reclaiming what bureaucracy had stolen, stayed lodged in his mind. He began visiting the dam more often, walking the spillway, checking the locks and levers. The water was high that spring, fed by heavy rains. He stood on the concrete lip one evening and listened to the low roar beneath his feet. 30 houses downstream. 30 houses that should never have been there. 30 houses that had been built on betrayal. It wasn't yet time, but he knew the day was coming. Richard's life became a cycle of letters, court filings, and sleepless nights. The HOA wasn't content with taking the land. They wanted to grind him into the dirt, to erase him financially as well as physically. The fines kept piling up, each one more ridiculous than the last. Failure to maintain community-approved fencing, violation of shared water resource guidelines, unapproved land use adjacent to Willow Creek Estates. Every envelope carried the same smug tone, as though they were daring him to resist. His lawyer tried to push back, but the fees mounted, and Richard realized with a bitter twist of irony that he was draining his retirement savings just to defend the right to what had been his in the first place. The financial pressure grew suffocating. He'd worked his entire life, carefully building up his 401k, dabbling in mutual funds, even buying small rental properties over the years. He had been prudent, the kind of man who avoided debt, who made payments on time, who believed in the slow, steady growth of compound interest. And yet, all it took was one HOA with political backing and developer money to threaten to unravel everything. His financial advisor sat across from him one evening, charts pulled up on a laptop. "You need to think about liquidity, Richard. If this escalates, you can't tie everything up in legal battles. You may need to sell one of your rentals, maybe even refinance your primary mortgage." Richard bristled at the suggestion. Refinancing his home, a place he had long since paid off, felt like humiliation. The idea that he would be forced into debt to fight thieves gnawed at him. But that was the genius of the HOA machine. They didn't just take, they forced you into financial traps that made resistance nearly impossible. Meanwhile, the families who had moved into Willow Creek Estates settled into their new homes, largely oblivious to the storm brewing beneath their feet. The HOA board hosted barbecues, sent out newsletters, and collected dues like clockwork. The new residents painted their doors, planted shrubs, and attended meetings where they voted on landscaping budgets and pool maintenance. It was all a glossy facade of order and community spirit, covering the rot of what had been done. Some residents, though, began to notice cracks. Literally. Small fissures appeared in driveways. Lawns stayed soggy long after rainfall. A few basements developed leaks. When they complained, the HOA president, a woman named Beverly with a perpetual smile that never reached her eyes, assured them it was all being monitored. What she didn't say was that the development had been built on unstable ground, with drainage patterns disrupted by the very reservoir Richard still controlled. Richard noticed, though, He saw the way runoff collected differently now. He knew the watershed better than anyone. He had grown up mapping it, understanding how heavy rains traveled across the valley, how the reservoir acted as both buffer and threat depending on the gates. And he knew something else. The HOA had built their precious homes directly in the floodplain. His grandfather had warned about it decades ago. The land was fertile, yes, but dangerous when the rains came heavy. It was why the reservoir had been created in the first place, to manage the risk. But developers in their arrogance had ignored that history. They had seen only cheap land and profit margins. The thought lodged deeper in his mind each day. The HOA could fine him, sue him, bankrupt him, but they could not erase the laws of nature. Water obeyed no court order. Still, Richard wasn't reckless. He reminded himself of that each night when the temptation grew strong. He did not want to hurt innocent families. He didn't blame the children riding bikes down cul-de-sacs or the retirees tending flower beds. His anger was aimed at the board, the developers, the smug attorneys who sent him letters as though he were already defeated. And so, he waited. In waiting, though, he began to prepare. He inspected the dam more thoroughly. He replaced worn bolts on the spillway levers. He cleared debris from channels. He made sure, if the time came, that he could act without hesitation. It wasn't just revenge. It was control. For once in this nightmare, he would have control again. The HOA, meanwhile, grew bolder. They began talking openly in meetings about expanding amenities, even referencing the reservoir in their notes. One document that found its way to Richard's mailbox referred to potential HOA oversight of the Willow Creek water feature. The audacity of it nearly made him choke. His reservoir, his grandfather's dam, now reduced to a water feature in their brochures. The financial assault continued too. The HOA placed a lien against one of Richard's rental properties, claiming unpaid fines. Tenants grew nervous. Some left. Rental income dropped. His financial advisor warned him that his portfolio stress was unsustainable. That phrase stuck with him, portfolio stress. It sounded clinical, like something out of a Wall Street report. But what it meant was this. His life's work was crumbling because of paperwork and arrogance. One night, as Richard pored over bills at his kitchen table, rain pattered steadily against the windows. He looked up and saw the reservoir shimmering under the storm, higher than he had seen it in years. The air felt heavy, charged. He imagined the homes below, their basements already prone to leaks, their driveways spidered with cracks. He imagined water coursing down the valley, unstoppable, cleansing in its fury. For the first time, he didn't push the thought away. He embraced it. It wasn't yet time, but he knew the time was drawing closer. The summer storms arrived with a vengeance. Dark clouds rolled in over the valley like an invading army, and the rain came down in sheets, hammering the rooftops of Willow Creek estates, and swelling the reservoir to dangerous levels. Richard had seen storms before, but even he felt a chill as he stood on the dam one night, flashlight beam cutting through the mist, and watched the water rising inch by inch against the concrete spillway. The next morning, the HOA was already buzzing with complaints. Beverly, the HOA president, sent out a chirpy email. Dear residents, please be assured the Willow Creek HOA is monitoring the weather situation and has everything under control. Richard nearly laughed aloud when he read it. Everything under control? They didn't even own the dam. They had no control at all. But the arrogance didn't stop there. That week, Richard received another letter, this one more brazen than any before. It wasn't just fines. It was a notice of intent to pursue eminent domain through the county for the reservoir land itself. The HOA wanted to seize the dam, rebrand it as a community amenity, and use it as leverage to increase property values for their development. Richard's hands shook as he held the letter. This wasn't just theft anymore. It was annihilation. If they succeeded, his family's history, his grandfather's work, his own years of stewardship over the reservoir, all of it would be signed away, replaced by HOA landscaping committees and pool parties. That night, he couldn't sleep. The rain drummed steadily outside, and the reservoir, already swollen, kept tugging at his thoughts. He walked outside with his flashlight, boots sinking into the mud, and stared at the dam again. The water was higher still, churning with a restless energy. He knew how much pressure the concrete could take. He knew the mechanics of the gates, the way a simple lever could turn the placid surface into a roaring torrent. For days, Richard tried to focus on other solutions. He called his lawyer, but the lawyer only sighed and reminded him how expensive litigation had become. He spoke to his financial advisor, who suggested selling his last rental and downsizing his own home to keep up with legal costs. Downsizing. Another word that stuck in Richard's throat like poison. Why should he shrink his life to accommodate thieves? Meanwhile, in Willow Creek Estates, the cracks grew worse. One young couple, Mark and Emily, noticed that their basement carpet squished underfoot after storms. Another homeowner discovered mold creeping up the drywall. The HOA dismissed complaints, assuring residents it was just new construction settling. But Richard knew better. The development was sitting on borrowed safety, protected only because he hadn't yet pulled the lever. The moment that broke him came on a Thursday afternoon. He was driving back from town when he saw a group of HOA board members gathered near the reservoir fence. They had clipboards, and one man in a suit pointed directly at the dam as they talked. Beverly noticed Richard's truck and gave him a tight smile, that smug little curve of her lips that had haunted him for months. Later that evening, another email arrived in his inbox. The HOA has voted unanimously to pursue reclamation of the Willow Creek water feature. Residents can look forward to a beautiful home-managed resource that will increase community value and long-term equity. Community value, long-term equity. Those were words Richard himself had used in investment meetings for years, but in this context they dripped with hypocrisy. They were stealing what wasn't theirs, and they dared to talk about equity. His land, his reservoir. That night, the storm grew fierce again. Thunder shook the valley, and lightning lit up the ridgeline. Richard stood at the dam in the pouring rain, water lashing his face, and stared at the gates. His grandfather's voice echoed in his memory. Water is power, son. It can nourish or it can destroy. But never forget, it cannot be stopped. The next morning, the HOA held a meeting in the clubhouse. Richard didn't attend, but he heard about it afterward from a sympathetic resident who slipped him notes. Beverly had announced the HOA was drafting papers to formally assume control of the reservoir. They even discussed raising HOA dues to build a walking trail around it, as though it were already theirs. The arrogance left Richard shaking with fury. He sat at his kitchen table that night, surrounded by unpaid bills and lien notices. His financial advisor's warnings about portfolio stress replayed in his mind. The numbers no longer added up. He could not win this through courts or balance sheets. They had him cornered. But they had overlooked one thing, the reservoir itself. Richard drove to the dam at midnight. The storm had not let up, and the water level was now dangerously close to spilling over on its own. He checked the levers, ran his hand across the cold steel, and took a deep breath. He thought of the homes below, their shiny new siding and manicured lawns. He thought of Beverly's smirk. He thought of his grandfather, standing on the same dam decades ago, proud and resolute. For the first time, he stopped resisting the idea. He didn't just toy with the thought of opening the gates. He accepted it as inevitable. The HOA wanted his reservoir. They wanted his land. They wanted his history erased. But the storm had given him leverage more powerful than any courtroom. And when the time came, Richard would use it. The morning after the storm, the air smelled of wet earth and ozone. Clouds clung to the ridge like smoke, and the ground squelched beneath Richard's boots as he trudged toward the dam. The water had risen so high it lapped at the very top of the spillway. He stood there, hands shoved deep in his jacket pockets, and stared at the roiling surface. The reservoir was no longer calm or reflective. It was restless, surging, hungry. His phone buzzed in his pocket. It was a new message from Beverly. He almost didn't look, but curiosity got the better of him. When he opened it, bile rose in his throat. The message was a photograph, taken from inside the Willow Creek clubhouse. On the wall behind Beverly and the HOA board, a blown-up concept rendering showed their vision of the reservoir turned into an HOA park. There were kayakers on the water, kids running on a trail, decorative lighting strung across the dam, and stamped across the top in cheerful letters, "Coming soon, a Willow Creek community feature." Richard's jaw clenched so hard his teeth ached. Coming soon. They were celebrating already, as if the land was theirs, as if his bloodline, his rights, his ownership didn't matter. And the cruelest part? The banks and county officials seemed to be playing along, nodding their heads at the HOA's proposals because they were dazzled by projected property values. That evening, Richard tried to work through numbers again. His financial advisor had warned him that litigation could cost upward of $300,000 if the fight dragged on for years. Even refinancing his home and selling his last rental wouldn't cover it. He had equity, yes, but liquidating it under duress would destroy the retirement portfolio he'd spent his life building. The HOA knew this. That's why they pushed so hard, so confidently. They weren't just trying to bleed him dry. They were betting he'd run out of fight before they did. But numbers didn't capture what they were stealing. His reservoir was more than just acreage. It was generational wealth, history, a legacy asset. You couldn't put that on a balance sheet. The rain kept falling through the week. Each morning he drove to the dam, and each morning the water was higher. On Friday night, he saw something that snapped the last tether holding him back. Down below, on the newly paved streets of Willow Creek Estates, children played basketball on driveways while their parents grilled under patio lights. Laughter drifted up toward him. A neighborhood that wasn't supposed to exist, built on his soil, on his stolen acres, was thriving as though they had every right. And all the while the HOA still mocked him, fining him for unmaintained vegetation near the fence line and threatening foreclosure if he didn't comply. The irony was grotesque. They were trespassing, yet he was the one threatened with losing his home. That night, Richard poured himself a whiskey, sat by the kitchen window, and watched lightning dance across the reservoir. He pulled out the old binder his grandfather had kept, filled with notes about the dam, engineering sketches, flow rates, handwritten warnings about pressure limits. At the back was a page Richard had never really thought about until now. In his grandfather's steady handwriting were the words, "When the reservoir rises beyond the spillway's crown, the choice is no longer whether to release, it is only how." By Saturday, the valley was soaked, and meteorologists predicted more rain. Willow Creek Estates carried on obliviously. Residents held a block party, music echoing into the hills. The HOA board strutted through the crowd like royalty. Beverly clinked glasses with real estate agents who were already marketing the community as the next big thing in county housing. Richard stood on the dam that evening, raincoat dripping, flashlight beam glinting off the steel levers. His hand rested on the release mechanism, cold and slick beneath his palm. It would take just one decisive movement. One action to undo everything they had stolen, everything they had dared to celebrate. He pictured the homes below, lights twinkling against the storm. He pictured Beverly's smug smile evaporating as water thundered down. He pictured the developers scrambling, the real estate values plummeting, the county officials forced to admit what they had ignored all along, that they had built an empire on stolen land, on foundations never meant to be theirs. Richard gripped the lever with both hands, braced his boots against the concrete, and pulled. At first it resisted, rust and years of disuse clinging to the mechanism. But then, with a groan that echoed through the valley, the steel gave way. The gate creaked open, and water surged forward with a deafening roar. It started as a steady gush, then swelled into a torrent. The reservoir, pent up and furious, released itself with unstoppable force. White spray erupted into the night air, and the ground trembled as the first wave barreled down toward Willow Creek Estates. From his vantage point, Richard could see the lights below flicker. People stopped in their driveways, staring toward the sound. A few pointed. Some screamed. Cars started to move, horns blaring as panic set in. The HOA board, still at their party, scattered like ants in the sudden downpour of chaos. The water tore through the streets, ripping up landscaping, swallowing playgrounds, and surging into basements that had barely dried from the last storm. Beverly's pristine clubhouse with its smug "coming soon" rendering on the wall stood no chance. Within minutes, water poured through its double doors, scattering chairs and soaking the smug smiles off every poster. Richard stood unmoving, rain pelting his face, eyes fixed on the chaos below. He didn't laugh. He didn't smile. He simply watched as the HOA's empire drowned under the weight of its arrogance. By dawn, the valley was unrecognizable. Willow Creek estates lay in ruin. Streets were mud rivers. Lawns were lakes. Cars were stranded like toys in puddles. The HOA's dream of increased property values had dissolved in one night, replaced by devastation. And Richard? He felt no regret. For the first time in months, he breathed freely. He knew consequences would come. Insurance investigations, county inquiries, maybe even lawsuits. But in that moment, standing on the dam as the sun rose behind storm clouds, he didn't care. Because the HOA had learned the lesson they refused to hear in words. The reservoir was his, and he had reminded them in the only language they seemed to understand: power. When the sun rose over the valley, the water had begun to recede, leaving behind devastation like a scar carved into the earth. Willow Creek estates looked less like a neighborhood and more like a disaster zone. Streets were broken, driveways split, basements caved in. Mud coated everything, from the ruined playground to the luxury SUVs stranded sideways in ditches. Richard stood at the dam's edge, staring at the wreckage with a strange calm. His boots were soaked, his raincoat heavy, but his shoulders, for the first time in years, felt lighter. He had expected guilt. He had expected trembling hands and a racing heart. Instead, he only felt the steady beat of his pulse, and a clarity sharper than any financial calculation. He had taken back what was his, not through courts, not through arguments, not through begging institutions that had ignored him, but through sheer, undeniable force. By noon, the county sheriff's office had cordoned off the neighborhood. News vans lined the highway, their reporters breathlessly describing unprecedented flooding in Willow Creek estates. Beverly was there, mud-streaked and furious, shouting at cameras about negligence, demanding answers. She called Richard's name, too, her voice breaking with anger. "He did this!" she cried, pointing up toward the dam. "That man is responsible." But reporters wanted a villain and a hero. Beverly, dripping in designer clothes ruined by water, looked every bit the villain, greedy, careless, desperate to shift blame. Richard, on the other hand, remained quiet. He didn't run from the cameras. He didn't hide from questions. He stood on his land, weathered and unflinching, with a binder of records and photographs that told the story of theft, abuse, and dismissal. When asked, he said one sentence: "They built on land they did not own, and the water reminded them of that." The clip went viral within hours. Insurance companies descended on Willow Creek estates like vultures. Adjusters shook their heads, snapping pictures, tallying damage that stretched into tens of millions. Policies had exclusions for acts of water release and negligent construction, leaving homeowners scrambling for answers. Mortgages teetered on default. Some families fled overnight, abandoning homes that were already worthless. And the HOA? Its reserve funds were laughably insufficient. They had spent most of their collected dues on landscaping, parties, and legal threats. Now, with lawsuits from residents piling high, their treasury evaporated within weeks. Investors who had speculated on Willow Creek lots panicked. Home values collapsed. Realtors who had once bragged about the next big community now quietly removed listings, unwilling to admit that backed a doomed project. County officials, embarrassed and cornered, tried to frame Richard as reckless. But every time they attempted to push the narrative, another piece of evidence surfaced. Permits ignored, complaints dismissed, surveys altered. Whistleblowers emerged, revealing how the HOA had promised inflated tax revenues in exchange for approvals. Suddenly, the blame shifted. What had once been painted as a quaint HOA development now looked like systemic corruption. Richard watched all of this unfold with the cold detachment of a man who had already paid his price. He knew lawsuits would come for him too. He knew Beverly wouldn't rest until she tried to drag him into court for damages. But he had prepared. With his financial advisor's guidance, he had already shifted assets into trusts, safeguarded his rental income, and refinanced his own home under protected clauses. The reservoir land itself, once seen as liability, now became leverage. Legal analysts on TV debated whether Richard's act was criminal or simply an unfortunate but natural release. His defense would cost money, yes, but compared to the HOA's bankruptcy, he was a fortress. One by one, families who had lost everything started contacting him. At first they were angry, furious at the destruction. But when they learned the truth, that the HOA had never owned the land, that Beverly and her board had gambled their futures on a lie, their anger shifted. Many turned against the HOA, filing suits not against Richard, but against Beverly and her allies personally. The board fractured. Members resigned. Beverly, once untouchable, found herself isolated, drowning not in water but in legal fees. Months later, Richard returned to the reservoir one quiet evening. The water had calmed, glistening under a fading sun. Birds skimmed across its surface, and the air smelled of pine and renewal. Willow Creek Estates below was a ghost town now. Empty houses with for sale signs that never came down. Streets overgrown with weeds. Silence where laughter once echoed. Richard leaned against the rail and closed his eyes. He thought of his grandfather's words. When the reservoir rises beyond the crown, the choice is no longer whether to release. It is only how. His how had been decisive, brutal, and final. He had defended his legacy, not through paperwork or compromise, but by wielding the very power his family had entrusted him with. And though the world debated whether he was a hero, a villain, or something in between, Richard knew the truth. He had simply reminded the valley of the oldest law of all. You cannot take what does not belong to you without consequence. And for Beverly, for the HOA, for every official who thought they could bury him under greed and red tape, the consequence had come in the flood. Richard turned from the dam, boots crunching on gravel, and walked back to his truck. The reservoir was quiet again. His land was his again, and for the first time in years, he finally felt free.